She appeared at the gate on a Tuesday morning in the third week of October, 1884, and Frank Stone said her name before she even swung her leg over the saddle. Martha. It came out of him like something breaking loose after years of being held underwater. Not a greeting, not a question. It was the sound a man makes when the thing he has spent 7 years trying to forget suddenly becomes more real than the ground beneath his boots. He had been standing at the fence post nearest the road, checking the latch on the lower pasture gate, when the rider crested the low rise at the edge of his land. The October light was thin and pale, the kind of light that made distances deceptive, but Frank Stone did not need perfect light or perfect distance to know that figure. He had spent 7 years teaching himself not to think about her, and in doing so had memorized every detail he was trying to forget. The line of her shoulders, the way she held the reins with her left hand slightly higher than her right, the particular angle of her chin when she was riding into something uncertain. His hand went still on the fence post latch. The iron was cold under his fingers. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that felt dangerous. She rode closer. The horse was a dun mare he did not recognize, which meant she had not come from anywhere he knew, which meant everything that had happened between them 7 years ago had rearranged itself into something new that he did not yet have a name for. She was still 10 feet from the gate when he said it. Martha. Her name, spoken in his voice, hung in the cold morning air between them. She had not yet dismounted. She had not yet said a word. She sat on that dun mare and looked at him with dark eyes he had last seen full of something he had not been man enough to face. And now those same eyes were full of something entirely different. Something that looked like it had cost her considerably more than the long ride to get here. He had not spoken her name in 7 years. He was not prepared for what it felt like to say it again. 7 years earlier, Frank Stone had not been the kind of man who owned land or checked fence post latches or rose before dawn to take stock of what was his and what was slipping away. He had been a different kind of man entirely, and it was that former version of himself that had destroyed the most important thing he had ever been given. The year was 1877, and Frank Stone was 26 years old, riding contracts between Abilene and the southern ranges of Kansas with a reputation built on 3 things. He was fast with figures, faster with a horse, and he never spoke a word he did not mean to speak. That last quality had made him valuable to men like Randall Cruz, who ran cattle operations that required a foreman who could keep secrets and move livestock across disputed territory without asking questions about the particulars. Frank had not been dishonest, exactly. He had been the kind of man who understood that the world operated on arrangements, and that the best thing a man with his particular skills could do was fit himself inside those arrangements cleanly and collect his wages without allowing himself to develop inconvenient moral sensitivities. Martha Yates had made that approach to life considerably more difficult. He had met her in Wichita in the fall of 1877, at the tail end of a contract's run that had gone sideways in 3 separate ways, none of them his fault, but all of them his problem. He had stopped at the telegraph office to send word back to Cruz about the delay, and Martha Yates had been coming out of the same office as he went in, and she had been carrying a stack of papers that she dropped when they nearly collided on the narrow front step, and Frank Stone had bent to pick them up, and when he looked up from the scattered documents, he found himself looking at a woman who looked back at him without the slightest trace of fluster. She was 23. Dark-haired, serious-eyed, with a quality about her that Frank had never encountered in anyone before, and had never been able to name precisely, except that it made him feel that she was standing in clearer light than everything around her. She thanked him for the papers in a voice that did not require anything from him in return, turned, and walked away down the main street of Wichita. Frank had gone into the telegraph office, sent his message to Cruz, and then turned around and followed her. He did not do it in the manner of a man pursuing a stranger. He was not that sort. He walked down the street, and she happened to be walking in the same direction, and when he reached the point at which he would have turned toward the boarding house where he had a room, he kept walking instead. He found a reason to pass the dry goods store, and she was inside. He found a reason to linger on the boardwalk, and when she came out she looked at him with those clear, dark eyes and said, "Did you lose something?" "I might have found something," he said. He had never in his life said anything like that before. He was not certain it even sounded like him. But she had smiled, small and careful, the kind of smile that suggested she was not easily given to smiling, and she had said, "That is a peculiar answer." "It is a peculiar situation," he said. Her name was Martha Yates. She had come to Wichita from a small property her family held near the town of Caldwell, south of Wichita, close to the Kansas border with Indian Territory. Her father, Theodore Yates, ran a modest operation, cattle and some dry goods trade, and Martha had come to Wichita on his behalf to file some legal correspondence at the telegraph office that he did not trust to be sent from Caldwell, because the Caldwell telegraph operator, one Cecil Potts, was known to have loose connections to certain men her father did not wish to know his business. She told Frank all of this over coffee in the dining room of the Wichita Hotel that same afternoon, speaking with the directness of someone who had decided that the most efficient way to determine whether a person was trustworthy was to give them real information and see what they did with it. Frank had listened to all of it carefully, and then he had said, "Your father is right to be cautious about Potts. Potts works for a man named Greer who has interests in land south of Caldwell, and if your father is running cattle on land that Greer wants, Potts will sell him information without a second thought." Martha had been still for a moment. "How do you know that?" Frank had told her the truth, which was the first time in a long while that the truth had seemed like the correct thing to say. He told her he ran contracts for Randall Cruz, and that Cruz and Greer had overlapping interests in the same southern Kansas territory, and that he had therefore spent some time learning what Greer's network looked like, because knowing your employer's rivals was part of doing your job well. What he did not tell her, because he had not yet acknowledged it clearly to himself, was that Cruz was not on the opposite side of the law from Greer. They were on the same side. The same side that was not the side of men like Theodore Yates. That omission would cost him everything. The weeks that followed were the most honest Frank Stone had been since he was a boy. He delayed his return to Cruz under a series of pretexts that he half believed himself. There were real complications with the contracts. The territory disputes were genuine enough to justify his presence. And Martha Yates was in Wichita for another 10 days, settling her father's legal matters, and in those 10 days Frank learned what it felt like to be seen by someone who had no interest in the arrangement of things, only in the truth of them. They rode out of town together twice that week, just to the open ground south of the river, where the Kansas sky went on so long, it felt like a moral statement about the smallness of human concerns. Martha talked about her family's land and what it meant to her, not in a sentimental way, but in the way of someone who understood exactly what a piece of ground cost in labor and intention. She talked about her younger brother, James, who had a talent for horses. She talked about her mother, who had died 3 years before, and who had left a particular quality of stillness in the Yates house that Martha had not yet worked out how to fill. Frank listened to all of it and found himself saying more than he had intended about his own history, which was thin and mostly unpleasant, an Eastern childhood that had not suited anyone involved. Early years in Missouri working for men who saw labor as a thing to be purchased and discarded without sentiment. The move west, which had felt at the time like the only direction that made sense. He did not tell her about Cruz, not the real shape of it. He told himself there was time for that later, when things were more settled between them, when the arrangement he had with Cruz was concluded, when he had found a cleaner way to make his living. He kissed her once, on the last afternoon before she was set to ride back south to Caldwell. They were standing near the river, and the light was going golden the way October light does in Kansas, long and warm and achingly temporary, and she turned to look at him with an expression that was neither surprise nor certainty but something between those two things, and he kissed her with more care than he had kissed anyone in his adult life. She said 3 days later that she would be willing to have him call on her at Caldwell if he meant what he seemed to mean. He said he meant it. He did mean it. That was the worst part. He meant it completely. He rode south to Caldwell in November of 1877 with honest intentions and a problem he had not yet solved, which was that the man who employed him, Randall Cruz, had ongoing business with Caldwell itself that was not going to simply rearrange itself because Frank Stone had developed honest intentions. Cruz ran a protection scheme. There was no cleaner way to say it. He offered security contracts to small operations along the Kansas border, and the security he was offering was primarily security against his own associates. Theodore Yates had refused Cruz's contract 3 years running, which had made Theodore Yates a problem. And Frank Stone, who had been riding for Cruz since 1875, knew all of this and had known it when he sat across from Martha Yates in the Wichita Hotel dining room and told her a careful, selective version of the truth. He had intended to quit Cruz before he arrived in Caldwell. He had written the letter in his head a dozen times. He had the bones of a plan that involved a stake he had been saving for 2 years and a piece of land out west, in the New Mexico territory, where Cruz had no reach and no interest. What he had not anticipated was how fast events would move. He arrived in Caldwell on the 8th of November, 1877, and called on Theodore Yates with his hat in his hand, and his intentions as genuine as he had ever managed. Theodore Yates was a tall, weathered man with the careful eyes of someone who had been watching the horizon for threats for long enough that it had become his natural resting expression. He received Frank without warmth but without hostility, which was the best Frank could have expected. Martha received him with something considerably warmer. They spent 2 weeks in that arrangement, Frank staying at the boarding house on Caldwell's Main Street, calling on the Yates property each afternoon, riding with Martha in the mornings when the weather held, eating Sunday supper with Theodore and James Yates, who was 17 and horse-mad, and decided within 4 days that Frank was the most interesting man he had ever met, which Frank found both gratifying and painful, given what he knew. On the 14th day, Cruz sent a man named Dahlin to Caldwell. Dahlin was not subtle. He found Frank at the boarding house and made it clear that Cruz had a timeline, and that the timeline involved the Yates property, and that Frank's ongoing presence in Caldwell was either part of that timeline or a complication of it, and Cruz needed to know which. Frank met Dahlin in the livery behind the boarding house, out of sight, and told him to tell Cruz he was done. Dahlin said that was not how it worked. Frank said he was aware of how it had worked in the past, and he was telling Dahlin clearly that it was not going to work that way anymore, and that if Cruz had a problem with that, Cruz was welcome to come discuss it with him directly. Dahlin rode out without another word, which was in some ways worse than an argument. 3 days later, Frank told Martha most of the truth, not all of it. He told her he had been working for a man whose operations were not entirely legitimate, and that the man had interests in the Caldwell territory that were adverse to her father's, and that he had known this when they met and had not told her, and that he was sorry for the omission, and that he intended to sever the connection entirely, and that his feelings for her were not part of any scheme or arrangement. Martha listened to all of it with the same quality of stillness she brought to most things, and when he finished she looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes and said, "What is the man's name?" he told her. He told her it was Randall Cruz. He watched something shift in her face that he did not understand at the time. Later, much later, he would understand it as the recognition of a specific kind of danger, not the dramatic danger of men with guns, but the quieter, more corrosive danger of secrets that had already done their work before the person keeping them decided to speak. She did not send him away, not immediately. She told him she needed time to think, and he gave her time, And in that time Dallin came back to Caldwell, not to find Frank but to find Theodore Yates. And whatever Dallin said to Theodore Yates produced in Theodore Yates an anger of such concentrated force that he came to the boarding house himself, on a freezing November evening, and told Frank Stone to get off his land and stay off his land and never address a single word to his daughter again. Frank asked to explain. Theodore Yates said there was nothing to explain. He said Cruz had sent word that Frank had been placed in Caldwell deliberately, that the whole sequence of events beginning with the apparent chance meeting in Wichita had been engineered, that Frank's role was to get close to the Yates family and learn the particulars of their land holdings so that Cruz could move on them with precise information. Frank said that was not true. He said the meeting had been genuine, that his feelings were genuine, that he had already sent Cruz word that he was finished. Theodore Yates looked at him with a kind of exhausted contempt that was worse than rage and said, "A man who rides for Cruz does not simply stop riding for Cruz by writing a letter." Then he left. Frank went to the Yates property the next morning. He needed to speak to Martha. He needed her to understand that the accusation Cruz had sent was a deliberate manipulation designed to remove him from the situation. It was exactly the kind of move Cruz made when a tool stopped cooperating. Discredit the tool, neutralize it, leave the target isolated and frightened and easier to move against. Martha came to the door. She looked at him across the threshold, and he saw in her face something that was not anger and was not grief, but was something past both of those things. She said, "My father showed me the letter Cruz sent. It had details that a man can only know if he was told them, Frank. It had the particulars of my father's land filing from when I went to Wichita, the specific documents I was carrying." "Those documents fell on the step," Frank said. "I picked them up, I saw what they were. And you reported what you saw to Cruz." "No." "Then how did he know?" Frank had no answer that worked. Not because he had reported to Cruz, because he had not specifically, but because he had mentioned, in passing, in an earlier report before he went to Wichita, that he was stopping in Wichita and might make inquiries about the land dispute situation in the Caldwell corridor. Cruz had presumably drawn his own conclusions and then used those conclusions against him in the most damaging way available. It was not innocence. It was a lesser guilt, but it was still guilt. He had operated in a world where information moved sideways, and he had not protected her from that movement with enough care. He stood at the threshold of the Yates house and looked at Martha, and he did not have a clean defense to offer. She said, with great quietness, "Please do not come here again." She closed the door. Frank Stone left Caldwell that same day. He rode north and then west, and he did not look back, because looking back was not something he had trained himself to do. He sent a final letter to Cruz that contained language too direct to be misunderstood, and then he cut every connection to that world and road until Kansas was behind him, and the New Mexico territory was in front of him, and the ground was dry and red, and said nothing about anything that had happened. He built his life in New Mexico with the same methodical attention he had previously given to things that did not deserve it. He found land in the southern part of the territory, between the mountains and the flat desert to the east. He filed the claim, broke the ground, built the house with his own hands and the hands of 2 men he hired and eventually trusted. He ran cattle on a modest scale. He learned the land. He did not speak Martha Yates' name for 7 years, not because he had ceased to think about her. He thought about her with a regularity that was somewhere between discipline and punishment. He thought about her when the October light came at a particular angle that matched the afternoon beside the river in Wichita. He thought about her when he heard a woman laugh with the specific quality of restrained amusement that Martha had brought to things that amused her. He thought about her when he sat on the porch in the evenings and looked at the mountains going dark and understood with the precision of long practice exactly how much he had lost. He did not speak her name because speaking it would have made it a wound he could not seal, and a man running a ranch alone in the New Mexico territory could not afford wounds he could not seal. He was 33 years old on the Tuesday morning in October, 1884, when the rider crested the rise at the edge of his land, and he said her name before she dismounted, and the 7 years of practiced silence broke apart like hardpan after the first spring rain. Martha. She swung down from the dun mare with the same ease she had always had with horses, landing in the red dust of the road and leading the horse forward the last few steps to the gate. She was 30 years old. The years had not diminished anything about her. They had done what years do to people who have been through hard things. They had given her face an additional layer of resolution, a quality of having survived the thing she feared and found herself standing on the other side of it. She stood at the gate and looked at him and said, "Frank Stone," not his name as a greeting, his name as a statement. As if she were establishing for both of them that this was a real thing, that the person standing before her was in fact the person she had ridden so far to find. "How did you know where I was?" he said. "I asked," she said. People who knew you. It took me the better part of a year to trace the direction." A year. She had spent a year finding him. He opened the gate. She walked through it, leading the dun mare, and he closed it behind her. And for a moment they stood close together in the cold October morning, with the mountains behind his house going pale gold in the early light, and neither of them said anything at all. "You should come inside," he said finally. "The horse needs water," she nodded. That was all. He took the dun mare's reins and led her to the trough near the barn, and Martha Yates walked beside him in the dust of his property, and every step felt to Frank Stone like walking through something he had thought was behind him, and discovering that it had simply been waiting for him to circle back. He settled the horse with grain and fresh water, working with the automatic competence of 7 years of daily ranch work, and when he turned around, Martha was standing in the barn doorway with the morning light behind her, and the sight of her standing there in that particular quality of light did something to the architecture of his chest that 7 years of careful construction had not prepared him for. "Why did you come?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who did not know the answer, but the quiet of someone choosing how much of the answer to give first. "My father died," she said, 2 months ago." Frank absorbed this. Theodore Yates. The tall, weathered man with the careful eyes who had looked at Frank with exhausted contempt on a freezing November evening and told him to leave. "I am sorry," Frank said. "He was sick for a long time," she said. "He had time to settle most things. He settled some things I did not expect him to settle." She reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced an envelope, folded and worn at the edges from handling, and held it out to him. Frank crossed the barn and took it. The envelope had his name on it, written in a hand he did not recognize, which meant it was not Martha's. "My father wrote that 6 weeks before he died," Martha said. "He gave it to me and told me to find you and give it to you." Frank looked at the envelope for a moment, then at her. "You came all this way to deliver a letter." "No," she said. "I came all this way because of what is in the letter. I came to deliver it in person because I thought you deserved to hear his words, and because I thought perhaps there were some of my own words I had owed you for a long time." Frank opened the envelope. The letter was 3 pages in Theodore Yates' hand, which turned out to be a large, deliberate script, the writing of a man who had not had much formal schooling, but had made himself literate through effort. Frank read it standing in the barn doorway with the morning light coming over his shoulder. Theodore Yates had written the following things, not in any particular order but with the accumulated weight of a man clearing accounts before he died. He had written that 2 years after Frank Stone left Caldwell, a man from the county land office named Hallies had come to see him about a fraud case involving Randall Cruz. Cruz had been prosecuted in 1880 and had been convicted of land fraud and extortion across 4 Kansas counties. As part of the proceedings, Hallies had interviewed Theodore Yates about his history with Cruz, and Theodore had produced the letter that Cruz had sent him in November of 1877, the letter that claimed Frank Stone had been a deliberate plant in the sequence of events leading to Wichita. Halle's had shown the letter to a prosecuting attorney, who had looked at it and told Theodore Yates that the letter was almost certainly fabricated. The timing was wrong. The particular details it contained were inconsistent with what Crewe's own records showed about Frank Stone's assignments in 1877, and the signature, while close, did not match Crewe's authenticated signature on other documents. The letter had been a forgery. Dahlin had forged it, most likely at Crewe's instruction, as a means of removing Frank Stone from the Caldwell situation cleanly and discrediting him simultaneously. Theodore Yates had written in his large, deliberate script that he had told Martha about the forgery at the time, in 1880, and that Martha's response had been something he had not anticipated. He had expected relief, perhaps some residual anger at the deception. Instead, Martha had been very still for a long time, and then said that she had already suspected the letter was not what it appeared to be, because she had known, even in the worst of her anger and hurt, that the details in the letter about the documents she had been carrying were not details Frank Stone could have reported to Crewe, because she had been the one who let the documents fall, and Frank had not reached for them until they were scattered. And a man reporting information to an employer does not report information he has not yet had access to at the time of the report. She had known. She had known, and she had let him go anyway, because in the moment of his standing at her threshold without a clean defense to offer, she had decided that the ambiguity of the situation was too great to navigate, and that the safest thing was to close the door. Theodore Yates wrote that he had spent several years being angry at what he considered Frank Stone's fundamental involvement with a corrupt operation, regardless of the specifics of that particular letter. He wrote that it had taken him until 2 years ago to acknowledge that a young man making his way in the world under difficult conditions could have a genuine change of heart, and that the evidence suggested Frank Stone had changed course completely and irrevocably before anyone forced him to. He wrote in the second-to-last paragraph that he was sorry he had not told Frank Stone directly, and that he was writing now because a man who is dying finds that some accounts simply must be settled before the end, and this was one of them. The last paragraph said only, "My daughter has been alone too long, so I suspect have you." Frank stood in the barn doorway for a long time after he finished reading. He was aware of Martha standing a few feet away, watching him with those dark eyes that had always known more than they said. "You knew," he said, "about the forgery you knew in 1880. "Yes," she said, "and you did not try to find me." The pause that followed was long and honest. "I was afraid," she said. "I was afraid that even if the letter was false, the situation was not entirely false, and that I had been right to be cautious, and that finding you would mean reopening something I had convinced myself I had healed." She looked away briefly toward the mountains, then back at him. "And I was afraid that you had moved on, that 7 years was enough time for a man to build a life with someone else in it." "No one else," Frank said. "No," she said softly. "My father seemed to think there would not be." The morning had warmed slightly, the October sun finding a higher angle, and somewhere in the dry grass past the barn, a meadowlark was making its case for the beauty of the world in total indifference to the two people standing in the barn doorway carrying 7 years of accumulated silence. "You should eat something," Frank said, "after the ride." "Yes," she said. They went inside. The house Frank had built was simple and solid. 2 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft above, a kitchen hearth that drew well. He had furnished it with the kind of care that a solitary person brings to their own space when they have decided that their own space is the primary relationship they are in. Everything placed with intention, everything functional, nothing purely ornamental except for a single print of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains pinned above the mantel that he had bought from a traveling artist, and paid more than he should have because it captured something true about the way those mountains looked at dusk. Martha sat at the table and looked at the room while Frank made coffee and cut bread and found the better part of a smoked ham that had been delivered from a neighbor 2 days before. He was aware of her looking at the room with an attention that was not casual, and he understood without asking that she was reading the room the way she read most things, for what it said about the person who had made it. "You built this yourself," she said. "Mostly. 2 men helped with the heavier framing." "It is a good house," she said. "It has been a good house," he agreed. She heard the particular weight he put on that, the past tense or the present tense that refused to close, and she looked at him directly. He set the coffee before her and the plate of bread and ham and sat across from her at the table, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full of the weight of everything that had not yet been said. "I need to say something," Martha said finally, "about closing the door. You do not owe me." "I do," she said with quiet finality. "I have owed it to you for 7 years, and I am going to say it." She set down her coffee cup and looked at him steadily. "I was wrong to close the door without letting you speak. You told me the truth about Cruz at considerable risk to yourself. You had already sent him word you were leaving. The fact that I let one forged letter and my own fear override everything I knew about you is something I have to be accountable for." Frank was quiet for a moment. "You were 23 years old," he said, "and I had given you genuine reason to doubt me." "You had," she said, "but not enough reason, and I made it enough by choosing fear over what I actually knew." She paused. "I am not asking you to forgive something I have a right to your forgiveness for. I am just telling you that I have spent 7 years understanding what I did, and that if you want to be angry about it, you are entitled." "I am not angry," Frank said. He said it simply, and it was the truth, because anger required a certain availability that he had spent 7 years sealing off. And now that the seal had broken, he found that what was underneath it was not anger but something considerably more difficult to look at. A kind of grief for time spent, a kind of gratitude that she was sitting across his table in the October morning, and a kind of hope that was almost painful in its unfamiliarity. "I am not angry," he said again, more quietly. "I am glad you are here." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and then she looked down at her coffee cup, and he saw the careful control she was exercising over her own expression, and it moved him more than anything she could have said. They talked through the morning, not about the 7 years, not initially, but about the practical recent past, which was the safer ground from which to approach the harder territory. She told him about Theodore Yates' last months, the lung sickness that had come on him 2 winters before and had progressed slowly, and then quickly at the end. She told him about James, her brother, who was 24 now and had married a woman from a ranch north of Caldwell, and was learning to run the Yates property with her guidance. The property was James' inheritance, which was as their father had wished, and Martha had received from the estate a sum of money that was modest but sufficient, and a horse, which was the dun mare in Frank's barn. She had come west with the money, the horse, the letter, and no particular plan beyond delivering the letter and saying what she had needed to say. "No particular plan beyond that," Frank said. "No," she said. "You rode the better part of 400 miles, he said, "with no particular plan beyond delivering a letter." "It was an important letter," she said. "Martha," she looked up at him. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what your father asked you to do, not what you owe. What do you want?" The question sat between them in the quiet kitchen with the morning light moving through the single window above the wash basin. She said, "I want to not have wasted 7 years." He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she rose to meet him. And when he took her face in his hands, she was already looking up at him with those dark eyes clear and open and without fear. And he kissed her with 7 years of careful restraint fully dissolved. And she kissed him back with the complete honesty of someone who had ridden 400 miles to do exactly this. Outside, the meadowlark continued its argument for the beauty of the world, apparently satisfied with how things were proceeding. The following days were not without complication, because complication was the nature of things, but they were the kind of complications that come from two people who are genuinely trying to understand each other after a long absence, rather than the kind that come from hidden motives or deliberate cruelty. Martha stayed at the neighboring Reyes family's property, which was 3 miles south, and where Elena Reyes, a kind and thoroughly unsentimental woman of 50, ran a clean boarding arrangement for travelers. Frank rode over each morning, and she rode back with him to the ranch, and they spent the days in the work of the place, which was not a romantic setting in any conventional sense, but turned out to be exactly the right one for them. Martha, it turned out, knew ranching. She had grown up working the Yates operation alongside her father and James, and she came to Frank's ranch with the practical knowledge of someone who understood that land was a daily argument you had to show up for. She had opinions about his fencing, which were correct. She had thoughts about his water arrangements, which led to a conversation that lasted 2 full afternoons and resulted in a plan to redirect a seasonal runoff channel that Frank had been meaning to address for 3 years and had not gotten around to because he had not had anyone to think through the engineering with. On the third day, riding back from checking the eastern fence line, she turned to him and said, "What are we doing, Frank?" "Checking the fence," he said. "Beyond the fence," she said. He pulled up his horse and she pulled up hers, and they sat in the afternoon light with the Sangre de Cristo range going purple in the east, and he said, "I would like to ask you to stay. I would like to ask you properly, but I do not want to ask you before you have had enough time to know your own answer." "I have had 7 years," she said. "7 years of being away from here," he said. "That is different from knowing what being here is like." She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and affection, which was a combination he had not seen on anyone's face directed at him before, and which he found entirely disarming. "Frank Stone," she said. "I know my own mind." "I know you do," he said. "I am asking you to let me ask you properly when the time is right. When will the time be right?" "Sunday," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Sunday," he said, with more certainty than he entirely felt. "I have a plan." "You have a plan," she repeated. "I have the beginning of a plan," he said. "Give me until Sunday." She gave him until Sunday. He spent Thursday and Friday in a state that the hands at a neighboring operation, the Castillo brothers, whom he hired occasionally for extra work, would have found unrecognizable in the man they knew as the most collected foreman in the southern New Mexico territory. He rode to the small town of Rincon on Friday, which was 18 miles north and the nearest settlement with anything resembling a commercial district, and he spent an hour in the general store, owned by a man named Taggart who regarded Frank's purchases with the carefully neutral expression of a merchant who understood that his livelihood depended on not commenting on the particulars of his customers' needs. Frank bought a jar of clover honey from the Eastern Territories, a length of ribbon in a dark green color that he spent more time selecting than any other single purchase in his adult life, and a small book of poems by Walt Whitman that Taggart had received in a shipment of assorted goods from an Eastern supplier and had been unable to sell for 6 months because Rincon's reading public had limited appetite for poetry. On Saturday, he made dinner. Not the functional, solitary cooking of a single man running a ranch, but actual dinner, with effort and attention. He had a recipe for a beef and green chili stew that Elena Reyes had written down for him 2 years before when she had served it at a neighborhood gathering, and he had asked her directly for the particulars because it was the best thing he had eaten since Kansas. He had the ingredients assembled by noon and spent the afternoon producing something that smelled, even to his own modest culinary assessment, extremely good. He rode to the Reyes property on Saturday afternoon and asked Elena Reyes if Martha Yates might be allowed the use of her wagon to come to dinner at his ranch that evening, and Elena Reyes looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had already formed her own assessment of the situation and said, "I will drive her over myself and collect her at 9. That is enough time." Frank thanked her with genuine feeling. Martha arrived at his ranch at 6:30 in the pale evening light, stepping down from Elena Reyes' wagon in a dress Frank had not seen before, a deep blue that made the dark of her eyes even more apparent, and she looked at the light coming from the windows of his house and at him standing on the porch, and she said, "You cleaned the porch." "I swept it," he said. "You swept the porch," she said. "For dinner." "Come in," he said. Dinner was everything the recipe had promised, and Martha ate it with the honest appreciation of someone who had been writing and working hard, and who did not perform indifference to good food on principle. They talked about everything and nothing with the ease of people who had been talking for several days, and had discovered that they had an inexhaustible supply of things to say to each other, not because they agreed on everything, but because they had both spent years developing thought on their own, and had the pleasure of matching those thoughts against someone who would push back cleanly when they disagreed. After dinner, he brought out the Whitman book, not as a gift yet, but to read aloud from, because he had found a passage in it that had said something he had been unable to say directly, and he thought that reading it aloud might serve as a bridge to the direct saying. He read, "I am not resigned, and I am not quiet, and there is in me a great noise of wanting, and of what I have known and what I have failed to be equal to." He had not found that passage in the book. He had made it up and he knew it, but it described something true, and he was not certain that its source mattered very much in the moment. Martha looked at him with quiet, clear eyes and said, "That is not Whitman." "No," he said. "Is it Frank Stone?" "It is Frank Stone," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Say the rest of it." He set the book down. "The rest of it," he said, "is that you are the most honest person I have ever known, and that I have spent 7 years building something that I built in the direction of what I wanted to deserve. And I do not know if I have arrived there entirely, but I know that I have been building it for you even when I was not admitting that to myself. And I would like to ask you to stay here, not as a visitor, not as a courtesy. I am asking you to stay as my wife, if that is something you are willing to be." The candle on the table between them burned steadily. Martha looked at him for a long time, and he watched her face move through something that he understood was not hesitation, but was the settling of a thing that had been a long time finding its place. "Yes," she said, simple as that, complete as anything he had ever heard. He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and outside the October night had fully arrived, and the stars over the New Mexico territory were in their proper positions, and the world was, for the moment, entirely as it should be. They were married 6 weeks later, in December of 1884, in the small adobe church in Rincon. The ceremony was performed by Father Guillermo Ortega, who had been at the church for 20 years, and who brought to the proceedings a quality of calm benevolence that Frank found deeply settling after years of managing things alone. Elena Reyes was there, and her husband Miguel, and the Castillo brothers, and a woman named Dorothea Hadley who ran the post office in Rincon and who had become, in the weeks of Martha's residence at the Reyes property, firmly in Martha's corner on most matters. James Yates rode down from Kansas for the wedding, which was a journey of considerable effort, and said more about his feeling for the occasion than any speech he might have made. He shook Frank's hand at the door of the church with a grip that communicated several things simultaneously, chief among them being that he had always liked Frank Stone and had spent 7 years not being able to say so, and now he was saying it with his right hand. Martha came down the short aisle of the adobe church in the deep blue dress, and when Frank saw her, he thought of the October morning at the gate, and the particular quality of clarity she had brought to his doorstep after 7 years, and he thought that the specific kind of courage required to ride 400 miles towards something you were afraid might have died was the kind of courage that a person was lucky to encounter once in their life. He thought he was the luckiest man in the New Mexico territory. Father Ortega said the words, and they said the words back, and outside the December sky was a color that had no name in any language Frank knew, a deep winter blue going toward silver at the horizon, and the mountains stood in their permanent positions, confirming that some things do not move. The first year of their marriage was everything that the years of building and waiting had been preparing Frank for without telling him. Martha brought to the ranch an energy that was not restless but was generative, the energy of someone who had been waiting for the right place to put her competence and her affection. She took over the bookkeeping of the ranch operation, which Frank had been managing with the blunt efficiency of someone who understood numbers but found no pleasure in them, and within 3 months had introduced a set of practices that improved their operating margin by an amount that Frank found both impressive and slightly humbling. She also had a talent with people that Frank had always lacked, not a social talent exactly, but a quality of directness that others found more reassuring than threatening. And within the first year, she had established the kind of neighborly relationships that turned isolated homesteaders into a functioning community. The Castillo brothers, Miguel Reyes, a Navajo man named Hostin So, who ran a small horse operation to the northwest, and whose knowledge of the land in all seasons was comprehensive and freely given once, he understood that the Stones were not the kind of people who collected knowledge and gave nothing back. Hostin So became, over the following year, something between a neighbor and a partner in the practical management of the range they shared. He taught Frank things about seasonal water sources and the movement of cattle in the mountain summers that added real value to the operation, and Martha learned from his wife, Azza, a quiet and extraordinarily capable woman, the medicinal properties of several plants that grew in the territory that Martha then began cultivating deliberately near the house. The land and the people on it gave the Stones their particular shape. In the spring of 1886, their first child was born, a boy. They named him Theodore, for Martha's father, and Frank delivered him himself with Azza present and advising, because Dr. Brennan from Rincon was 4 hours away, and Theodore Stone had decided that waiting was not part of his plan. Theodore was a large, healthy, loud baby who made his opinions about the world known from the first hour, and Frank Stone, who had spent 7 years learning to manage his own emotional landscape with careful minimal maintenance, found himself completely undone by an infant who was approximately the length of his forearm, and who appeared to regard Frank's face as the single most satisfying thing in the universe. He held the baby in the quiet of the first night, Martha asleep after the hard work of bringing him in, and he sat in the rocking chair near the window looking at the mountains in the moonlight and the child in his arms, and he understood with full clarity what he had been building toward for 7 years, and how exactly it was supposed to look and that it looked like this. Martha found him still awake at dawn. "Come to bed," she said. "In a moment," he said. "I am memorizing this." She stood beside the rocking chair and put her hand on his shoulder and looked at their son, who was asleep with the complete commitment to sleep that only new infants achieve, and she said softly, "What are you memorizing?" "What I almost missed," he said. She leaned down and kissed the top of his head, and he reached up and took her hand without looking away from Theodore, and they stayed like that in the early light until the baby began to reassert his opinions about the world and breakfast became the immediate priority. Life on the ranch had its difficulties, as all lives do. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that was the worst in recent memory, and Frank and Miguel Reyes and Hostin So spent 3 weeks in July engineering a channel from a higher seasonal water source to bring water to the cattle on the lower range, working long days in brutal heat, coming home covered in the red dust of the territory. Martha managed the household and the baby and the books and the constant practical problem-solving of a ranch under water stress, with a competence that would have been remarkable in ideal conditions and was extraordinary in difficult ones. Randall Cruz died in a Kansas prison in the summer of 1886, which Frank learned from a letter that James Yates sent along with a note that said simply, "Thought you should know. Good riddance to it." Frank folded the letter and set it on the mantel and felt nothing that required significant management, which was itself a kind of settling. Some chapters ended, and the ending was simply the ending, with no particular drama attached. The drought broke in August, as droughts in that territory generally did, with a violence of rain that was almost comical in its contrast to the weeks of dry. Frank and Martha stood on the porch in the warm rain and watched the water come down, and Theodore, who was 4 months old and thoroughly curious about everything, observed the rain from the shelter of his mother's arms with an expression of focused scientific inquiry that made both his parents laugh. In 1887, a man named Percy Hollis arrived in Rincon with capital and intentions to establish a land company that would purchase and consolidate small operations in the territory. He had the specific manner of a man from back east who had read about the West and formed conclusions about it from a comfortable distance, and his first visit to the Stone Ranch, where he arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon with a contract and a price that was lower than the land was worth, produced one of the very few times that Frank Stone allowed himself to be openly cold to another human being. Martha handled it differently. She received Hollis on the porch with perfect courtesy and offered him water and listened to his entire proposal. And then, with the particular combination of precision and finality that she brought to most things, outlined for him exactly why the price was insufficient, what the correct valuation of the property would be, and what the legal structure of any such transaction would need to look like in order to be valid under New Mexico territorial law, which she had been reading carefully since they were married. Hollis left without his contract and without any of the easy satisfaction he had expected to derive from what he had imagined was a transaction with an isolated rancher who would not know better. "You have been reading territorial law," Frank said. "For a year," she said. "Why?" "Because men like that are always coming," she said. "They have always been coming. My father knew that. I knew it before I was 15. She looked at him with those clear dark eyes. "I would rather be prepared than surprised." He pulled her close and she let herself lean against him in the way she had developed of leaning, which was not a dependency but a choice, the temporary surrender of a person who was never at any other moment off balance. "What did I do," he said into her hair, "before you were here?" "You managed," she said. "People manage. It is not the same as living well." That winter was mild, which in the New Mexico territory meant it was merely cold rather than brutal, and they spent the evenings of it in the particular domesticity that Frank had never expected to find, and now could not imagine the absence of. Martha reading. Theodore, who had learned to move independently at a startling rate, exploring the limits of the front room with the methodical determination of a small explorer who suspected the furniture was concealing important information. Frank doing the end-of-day accounting or mending tack, or simply sitting in the warm room with his family around him, which was not nothing and was, in fact, everything. He thought sometimes about the young man he had been in 1877, writing contracts for Randall Cruz with a carefully maintained indifference to the moral weight of the work, and he could understand that man without defending him. That man had been operating on the information available to him, and the habits instilled by years of moving through a world that did not offer a great deal of warmth or guidance. The correction had not been simple or without cost, but the correction had happened and the cost had produced something. James Yates came south for Christmas of 1887 with his wife Clara, who was a straight-backed, good-humored woman from the Caldwell area who had already been running the Yates ranch alongside James with considerable efficiency, and who took to Martha with an immediate warmth that suggested the two women recognized each other as belonging to the same essential category of person, someone who could do the work and did not require applause for doing it. James held Theodore for the better part of Christmas afternoon with the focused attention of a man who had decided that this specific infant was the best infant in the territory, which Theodore appeared to accept as his due. Frank watched his wife and her brother together, the ease of their conversation, the shared reference of people who had grown up in the same house and survived the same losses, and he felt the weight of the 7 years as a simple fact rather than a wound, a period of time that had shaped them both and brought them to this room in this particular configuration. And he did not wish it away so much as understand it finally as part of the whole. On the last evening of James and Clara's visit, James found Frank at the barn after dinner, ostensibly to check on the horses before the morning's early departure. They stood in the barn in the comfortable silence of men who did not require speech to occupy shared space, and after a while James said, "My father liked you, you know, even then. He told me that after you left. He said he had liked you and that it made him angrier than anything else." Frank was quiet for a moment. "I was sorry to cause him that." "He knew," James said. "By the time he died, he knew most of what he needed to know about the particulars of it. The forgery, the whole of Crewe's operation." He paused. "He said you were a man who had made himself, and that making yourself was harder than being made by circumstance, and that he had come to respect the effort even if the timing had been unfortunate." "That is generous," Frank said. "He was not a generous man," James said, "but he was a fair one. Eventually." Frank nodded. He thought of the letter, the large, deliberate script clearing accounts before the end. He thought of the line about his daughter being alone too long. "He sent her to find me," Frank said. "He told her," James said. "He could not send her anywhere she did not want to go. He told her and she went." He looked at Frank with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a younger man who had made his assessment and was content with it. She wanted to go. She had wanted to go for a long time before he said it. She just needed someone to tell her the wanting was worth the risk. Frank looked at the horses in the stalls, their steady breathing in the cold air. The barn was warm with animal heat and the smell of hay and the deep quiet of a December night in the territory. "I am glad she came," Frank said. It was the most insufficient thing he could have said, and also the truest. "I know," James said. "It is on your face every time you look at her." He clapped Frank once on the shoulder, and they went back inside. The year 1888 brought two significant things to the Stone Ranch, which were related but arrived at different points in the year. The first was that Frank was asked by the county land office, on the recommendation of several neighboring operations including the Ray's family and Hosting So, to take on a role as a territorial land assessor, which was a formal designation that came with modest authority and the responsibility of certifying land valuations for disputes and transactions in the surrounding area. The work suited him. His background in contracts and his 7 years of close knowledge of the territory gave him a perspective that was useful, and Martha's legal reading meant that they functioned as an effective team on the more complex cases. The second significant thing was that Martha told him in the spring that they were expecting another child. Theodore received the news with the equanimity of a 2-year-old, who did not yet understand the precise implications, but was alert to the general tone of celebration, and decided to participate in it by dancing in a circle in the front room until he fell down, which everyone agreed was the appropriate response. Martha's second pregnancy was easier than her first in some ways and harder in others. The autumn of 1888 was dry again, though not as severely as 1886, and the additional physical demand of the pregnancy, combined with the ongoing work of the ranch, tested her in ways she met with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything. Frank made the kind of adjustments that required him to do more of the outdoor work himself, and managed this without comment, because it was obvious, and because commenting on the obvious was not something either of them did. The baby was born in December of 1888, a girl this time, delivered with Dr. Brennan in attendance since there was no weather emergency to prevent it. They named her Eliza, after a gray tan of Frank's who had been the only adult in his Eastern childhood who had treated him with consistent kindness, and whose name he had been carrying for a long time waiting for a reason to use it. Eliza Stone arrived in the world with the exact opposite disposition from her brother. Where Theodore had opinions he announced at full volume, Eliza observed. She was a quiet baby, watchful, with Frank's particular quality of stillness and Martha's depth of attention, and she was from the first weeks clearly taking in more than she could yet express, which her parents found both charming and, in their more honest moments, slightly unnerving. "She is watching everything," Frank said, on a January evening, holding Eliza near the fire while she examined his face with the focused attention of a scholar reviewing a primary source. "Good," Martha said from across the room where she was nursing a cup of coffee and going over the ranch accounts. "The world rewards the people who watch it carefully. You are not concerned." "That my daughter is perceptive," Martha said. "No, Frank, I'm the opposite of concerned." He looked down at Eliza, who had apparently found something satisfactory in her examination of his face and had closed her eyes, and he felt the particular quality of joy that had become the constant background condition of his life in the years since the October morning when everything broke loose and became possible again. Theodore and Eliza grew up on the ranch in the way children grow up in that country, with a great deal of space and a great deal of work, and the kind of education that came partly from the Rincon schoolhouse and partly from the land itself, and partly from the particular quality of their parents' attention. Martha had begun, by 1890, to teach some of the neighboring children as well, informal sessions at the ranch on Saturday mornings that addressed the gaps in what the Rincon school provided, which were considerable. She taught reading and arithmetic and some history, and to the considerable surprise of some of the fathers in the area, some basic principles of territorial law, which she considered a practical necessity for people whose land and livelihoods depended on their understanding of the legal frameworks that governed them. Frank built a second room onto the house in the summer of 1890 to accommodate the sessions, which had grown in attendance to 12 children by then, and also to accommodate the continued growth of a family that had demonstrated a consistent willingness to expand. Martha told him in the fall of 1890 that Eliza would have a sibling, and this time Theodore, who was 4 and fully verbal and opinionated about most things, received the news with the air of someone who had expected as much and was prepared to accept it on a provisional basis. The third child was a boy, born in April of 1891. They named him Samuel, after no one in particular, but because it was a good solid name, and because Theodore had proposed it with the complete seriousness of a 4-year-old who had given the matter genuine thought, and both Frank and Martha had found this sufficient reason. Samuel Stone was from the beginning a different personality from either of his older siblings. Where Theodore was vocal and Eliza observant, Samuel was social in the most fundamental sense. He wanted to be where people were and wanted those people to be happy, and he deployed for this purpose a smile of such uncomplicated warmth that it was essentially impossible to resist. Hosteen So, who was not by nature a demonstrative man, took one look at Samuel at 3 months old and said he was going to be a man the horses trusted on sight, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary. Hosteen So was right, as he generally was about such things. The summer of 1892 brought a difficulty that was the last significant external threat the Stone Ranch faced in those years. A cattle disease moved through the territory from the north, hitting several operations hard, and the Stone herd was not spared. Frank lost a third of his breeding stock to it over a period of 3 weeks that were among the hardest of his adult life, not because of the loss itself, but because of what it required him to face. The reality that a ranch with 3 children and an expanding operation was more fragile than his 7 years of solitary building had prepared him to manage. He did not hide this from Martha. That was not their arrangement. He sat down with her and the account books and they looked at the real situation together, and Martha looked at it with the same clear-eyed quality she brought to everything that was difficult and said, "We have the savings from the land assessor work. We have the neighboring relationships, and we have time if we manage it carefully." "It will be a lean year," Frank said. "We have managed lean years," she said. "The land is still here. The house is still here. We are still here." She said it without sentiment but with a bedrock certainty. That was one of the specific things Frank Stone loved about her, with a force that had not dimmed in 8 years of marriage, but had simply grown into the structure of his daily experience so completely that it was no longer separable from the experience itself. They managed. The Castillo brothers worked through the difficult months at reduced wages. They insisted on themselves, as a gesture of solidarity that Frank and Martha accepted with sincere gratitude and without false protest. Hostinso contributed materially from his own operation in ways that Frank would spend the following 2 years repaying in kind. Elena and Miguel Reyes brought food and labor, and the particular comfort of long neighbors who understood that help offered without conditions was the only kind worth offering. The herd rebuilt. By the fall of 1893, the operation was back to full strength, and in some ways stronger for having been restructured in the aftermath of the disease, because Martha had used the period of reduced scale to redesign the breeding program with more careful attention to disease resistance that would pay forward for years. Frank was 39 in 1890, and he had the physical condition of a man who had done hard outdoor labor for 15 years, and the interior life of a man who had been loved well for 8 years, and the combination produced in him a quality of settled strength that people meeting him for the first time found difficult to entirely account for. He was not an easy man in social terms. He was still more comfortable with silence than with noise, still more reliable than charming. But there was something about the way he moved through the world, the quality of his attention and the completeness of his presence, that communicated a man at home in his life in the deepest possible sense. Martha, at 36, was the person who had made him that way, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and the knowing was not a debt but a fact they both carried with the same honest acknowledgement they brought to everything. They talked still, in the evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, about the things they had always talked about. The practical concerns of the land and the operation, the wider movements of the territory and the nation, the slow and still often unjust processes by which the West was being settled, the specific challenges faced by families like the Hostinso family and others whose claims to the land predated everyone else's, and who were engaged in a constant and often losing argument with official systems that had been designed without their interests in mind. Frank used his land assessor role when he could to ensure accurate valuations. Martha taught law. It was not enough. They both knew it was not enough. They did what they could and acknowledged honestly that doing what they could was better than not doing it, which was the only honest position available. The children grew. Theodore at 8 was everything he had promised to be. Loud, enthusiastic, horse-mad like his Uncle James, with the specific quality of fearless physical confidence that worried his parents in the normal parental way, and filled them with the normal parental pride they tried not to display too obviously. He had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and his own particular irreducible Theodore quality that defied combination. Eliza at 7 was reading at a level that made the Rincon schoolteacher write Martha a note saying she was uncertain what else she could teach her, and asking if Martha had suggestions, which Martha did. Eliza read everything. She read the ranch accounts for entertainment. She read the newspapers that came from Santa Fe and from back east when they arrived, which was irregularly. She asked questions that required Frank to think before answering, which he found more enjoyable than he would have predicted. Samuel at 3 was the social center of the ranch in a way that no 3-year-old had any business being, known to every animal and person on the property by name, and known to them by a name that was, in Samuel's pronunciation, not quite Samuel, but was understood by everyone to mean something essential and good. In the spring of 1893, Frank and Martha sat on the porch on a warm evening after the children were asleep, the territory spread before them in the deep blue of a New Mexico dusk, and Martha said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I want to tell you that I am happy," she said. "Not because everything is easy. Things are not always easy. But I am happy in the specific sense of being exactly where I am supposed to be." "Yes," he said. "You are not surprised," she said. "I know you," he said. "I have been watching you be happy for 8 years. I recognized it early." She turned to look at him with the particular expression he loved most on her, which was the expression she had when something he said matched something she had been thinking exactly. And she leaned against him in the way she had, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch in the warm spring dark and looked at their land and their mountains and their life, which was all around them and entirely, irrevocably theirs. The stars came out, one by one and then all at once, the way they did in that country where there was no competing light. And Frank Stone thought of a Tuesday in October 9 years before, when a rider had crested the low rise at the edge of his land, and he had said a name he had not spoken in 7 years. And he understood with the full precision of experience that it had been the most consequential word he had ever spoken. Not because it had begun anything, because it had ended the 7 years of not saying it, and everything worth having had flowed directly from that ending. They went inside when the night cooled, Martha first and then Frank, who paused at the door and looked back once at the mountain standing in the dark and the stars and the gate at the road where it had happened. And then he turned and went inside to his family and closed the door behind him. And the meadowlark in the dry grass somewhere nearby said nothing, because it was night and meadowlarks do not sing at night but would be back in the morning, which was enough. Martha was already at the kitchen table when he came in, writing by lamplight in the ledger she kept for the ranch accounts. Theodore's boots were by the door, and Eliza's book was open on the chair by the fire, and Samuel's small cup was still on the table from supper. The fire was low and warm, and the room smelled of the day's cooking, and the particular warm smell of a house that has been fully inhabited. Frank sat down across from Martha at the table, and she looked up from the ledger and looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes, and then looked back at the ledger and said, "The spring cattle count needs to be done this week." "Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she agreed. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his without looking up from the ledger, and they stayed like that in the lamplight, with the mountains outside in the dark and the children asleep above, and the ranch all around them in the warm New Mexico night, holding each other's hands across an ordinary table in a house they had built together in the country they had made their own. 7 years of silence had ended with a name. Everything else had followed from there. The year 1894 brought one more child, the last they would have, born in July when the territory was hot and golden, and the mountains were the most vivid green of summer. Another boy. Frank held him on the porch in the early evening of his first day, while the older children circled with the particular combination of fascination and proprietary interest that siblings bring to new arrivals. And Theodore said the baby should be called Frank, and Martha said that was a sensible suggestion if his father agreed. And Frank looked at the small face in his arms and thought about a young man in 1877 writing contracts in the wrong direction, and about a gate and an October morning, and about what it meant that this child existed, that any of them existed, that this life existed. "Frank Jr.," he said. The baby opened his eyes briefly, apparently considered this, and went back to sleep, which everyone took as assent. The name was a bridge between the man Frank Stone had been and the man he had become. And the man he had become had Martha beside him on the porch in the July evening, and Theodore and Eliza and Samuel, arranged on the steps in descending order of age, and the ranch behind them and the mountains beyond that. And the last edge of the day going gold, and then rose, and then the deep blue that he had learned over 12 years to read as the sky saying something permanent about the nature of this place, and the nature of what was possible when a man stopped riding in the wrong direction and said the name he had been afraid to say. The gate at the end of the road was closed now in the ordinary way of a rancher's gate. no longer the site of the most important Tuesday morning of Frank Stone's life, but simply the entrance to a property that was his and Martha's and their children's, and the beginning of the road that went north to Rincon and south to the range, and in both directions to a world that was not always kind, but was theirs to navigate together. They had navigated it together for 9 years. They would navigate it for many more. The Meadowlark was back in the morning, as promised, making its argument for the beauty of the world in the October light, and Frank Stone stood at the fence post and listened to it and was entirely persuaded.